Hello. Welcome to the third episode of Nationalist Scorecard. Today we will be diving in to the controversial figure Tommy Robinson. Tommy is sometimes called the most hated man in Britain. But is that really true? We see these protests after he was arrested, and we have thousands of people coming out holding signs to say, "Free Tommy." So it's really just the media who's telling us that Tommy is the most hated person in Britain. And we will get to Tommy's arrest and its implications later in the segment. I want to start off by saying I don't think that Tommy is a Zio shill. Although he does call himself a Zionist, he's used that term before, basically just saying he commiserates with Israel and views them as victims. Now, I don't think that he's doing this wittingly, and therefore I wouldn't call him a shill or a stooge or anything like that. I think he's just a regular guy who has bought in hard to all of the globalist propaganda that he's received over his 35 years of life. I think that Tommy cares about the future because he has two young daughters, and he doesn't want to even imagine a future in which they will face abuse and harassment and rape unless they cover up their bodies and convert to Islam. Tommy wants to go back to the UK of 20 years ago or earlier, before all this mass Muslim migration began, because it is a relatively recent phenomenon, compared to a country like the United States, which has had an African American population for much, much longer, that has been living with multiculturalism. Well, this is a fairly new phenomenon for the UK, and the UK still is close to 90% white. I think it might be somewhere around there. Oh, I stand corrected. According to the 2011 census, the white British population was at 82% of the total UK population. But again, not nearly as bad as other places. So why are people so black-pilled about Britain? Well, it has to do with their laws. They do not have the same rights of free speech there as we have in the United States. And all of this puts Tommy in a very difficult position, right? Because he wants to say that he is not racist. He will deny up and down all day the accusations that are thrown at him of far right and Nazi and racist. And I think this is to his detriment, right? The reason that they use these words isn't because they hold any water. It's because people like Tommy will react to them and deny them. And that shows a weakness. It's like a blood in the water. And so a lot of people on the alt-right have come to the conclusion that what should be done is agree and amplify, even if you're not actually a racist, which I don't think many people are, and you would even have to define what you actually mean by racist, which no one ever wants to do. But the question I have for Tommy is, if the price of protecting Britain's future is a little bit of what you call bigotry or racism, if that's the only option forward, would you make that deal? I think Tommy has the potential to be, in respect to the identitarians and the nationalists, either one of the biggest allies or our biggest threat. I'm sorry that's the way it has to be, Tommy, but at some point, either you or your children are going to be forced to choose between so-called Nazism, really just enforcing borders based on race, and Islam. We're not being given another option, and I don't think it's going to be possible to find another option, and Tommy represents the last gasp of this sentiment that we have to find a way. We have to find a way to make multiculturalism and, well, he would say integration. We have to find a way to make integration work. And so my greatest fear isn't that Jews or Muslims or Mexicans are going to win, so-called. My greatest fear is that whites who would rather die and see their civilization crumble than admit that they're wrong are going to be the ones fighting us. That's how we get brother wars. And that's what we can't let happen. Now let me dive into the first point, which is, of course, opposing open borders. I give Tommy a B-. Tommy was born and grew up in Luton, a small industrial city which is very run down. It's very rough and tumble, and that is reflected in Tommy's persona, in almost every fiber of his being, including his accent. But really, the demographic and Islamic change, the demographic and cultural change of Luton has really defined, in many ways, Tommy's views and his stance. Luton is today 25% Muslim, and whites are an ethnic minority in this town. So yeah, he was red-pilled by life, as they say. Tommy's father is English and his mother is Irish, and so he sometimes says, "Yeah, I'm an immigrant. Everyone is the child of immigrants." I'm sorry. You'll have to excuse me. I will not be doing a good impression of Tommy Robinson. I just can't nail down the accent. But yeah, Tommy's father was, I believe, some kind of manufacturer, and I think that impacted Tommy, who went on to have a business of plumbers. So yeah, very, very much white working class. He is known for having, gotten into scuffles in his life when he was young. He hung out in the Luton Town Football Club. This is where he had a lot of encounters with riotous and rowdy Muslims. And so, yeah, he got into these fights, and he himself will admit that he has sort of this past, which is rough around the edges, to say the least. But he sort of entered into politics, beginning in 2004. He joined the BNP, and then after a year he left, saying that it was too extreme right, too nationalist, and he wasn't down for that. Then later in 2009, he formed the English Defence League, which he led until 2013. And he's formed some other groups, such as the UK branch of Pediga. He has worked with Rebel Media for a little bit, and then before declaring himself an independent journalist, with goals to create a large media organization. So, absent the jailings, which I promised we will get to, that sort of brings us up to speed on Tommy's history. Now, first, let's get into what Tommy's done well. So he has done a fantastic job of exposing the grooming gangs and scandals, which the police, for years and years, were trying to cover up. And if you've never heard the term grooming, it's essentially rape gangs of Muslims. In his interview with RT, the interviewer is asking Tommy, what do you see for the future of Britain? Let's say we accept all of these problems. What are some solutions? What can we actually do? And so I think he's very Trumpian on a lot of his solutions. He's basically calling for the same thing, which is temporary halt to all Islamic immigration to the UK, to temporarily stop building mosques that are funded by Qatar and Saudi Arabia and all these Muslim places. to close down the Sharia law courts and outlaw Sharia law, to close down the madrasas, which is the Muslim schools. And he also says we should segregate the prison system so that more people aren't radicalized. And he talks often about the prison systems and how this is a big problem. These are basically breeding grounds for Muslim terrorists because there's this pressure. You get beaten up if you don't convert to Islam. That is, of course, how Islam spread from the very beginning. And so the idea that Islam is a religion of peace is just laughable. In this interview, Tommy says, "We need the police armed. We're at war."
They're at war with our country and they're not going to change. They are, and until that war is over, which as soon as we accept, if our government accepted we was in a war, then the police officer that was killed on Westminster Bridge a year ago today would not have been killed. He was unarmed because it doesn't look nice. Lee Rigby's base, there was no military.
Would you arm police officers?
Yes, I would, yeah. They need to be armed in the situation we're in. We're at war.
Would you have military on the streets of Britain?
You need it. At certain times, you need it. Well, the point is that even when Lee Rigby was killed, there was no armed personnel near there. That army barracks is within 5 miles of the biggest Sharia zone in Europe. We're at war. 2,000 young British Muslims went to fight for ISIS. We have 23,000 of them that we know about, and we're watching and monitoring.
See, he gets it. And then he says Hitler was a teddy bear compared to Muhammad. Now, of course, he will say, Hitler's a terrible guy, and if Nazism was a religion and it was spreading through our country, I would advocate for the same things. Okay, whatever. We'll let him have his virtue signal there. I'm not a huge fan of National Socialism myself, but I think it's important to remember the context in which it came about. But I just love that part there. We're at war. A lot of people don't get that, and he is helping people to see that. I despise war because it's so often used by the elite to just oppress the people more, to place more restrictions on us, to limit our freedom. But in this case, I would totally agree with him that we're at war. I would just question who we're at war with, and of course we'll get to that later. Tommy says, "This is not a left-wing or a right-wing issue." And I think he's right. He may be right for the wrong reason, but he's right. He'll couch this kind of rhetoric in simply being a common sense issue. But that really just translates into a white issue, right? In a homogeneous society, all ethnic groups will vote down the middle, between right and left. This is assuming that they can even have a democracy, and we do know that basically once you get an average IQ less than 90, you really can't have a democracy. But for the sake of argument, let's just say all these homogeneous groups, they have democracy. Well, there's always going to be a middle, and there's always going to be a left and a right. It's just that the center for various groups, various ethnic groups, is very different. Whites are the furthest right. So, it's not an IQ thing, right? Because if it was just, the higher the IQ, the more rightward you would go, then Asians and Jews would be to the right. But they're not. They vote left. Currently in the States, I know you have 90% of blacks voting left. You have 60 to 70% of Hispanics voting left, 60 to 90% of Jews voting left, depending on, what the candidate says in support of Israel, and then 85% of Muslims voting left. So this is a big deal, and this is why we're getting the shift leftward to a large degree. If you just sort of take an average sampling of the demographics, you sum it up by how brown is it? Well, it kind of gives you a pretty good approximation of how left it's going to be. So Tommy talks about a lot of great things, and as far as immigration goes, it might be what people need to hear. We might need to maybe they're only ready to hear right now that we should cut off people of a certain religion. But that's not going to cut it in the long term. It has to be deeper than that. The other thing that Tommy will say is, I'm not against Muslims, right? He draws this distinction between Muslims and Islam. He's very clear to make that distinction. And he says, Muslims are people. That's the difference. And so, I know plenty of good Muslims, and a lot of the left wing will come at him and criticize him for putting this blanket statement on all Muslims. And they do this with Trump too. Oh, you just hate all Muslims, don't you? Well, let's think about the moderate Muslims, right? The question is, what is their implicit consent for violence? Because there is such a thing as a sin of omission. If you see some white guy beating up a black person or whipping a black person and saying, we need to go back to the days of slavery, right? Like some farcical thing, you're never going to see it. But can you imagine like a white person just seeing that hatred and racism and all of that stuff on display, and a white person walking by and just saying, well, I don't want to get involved, I mean, maybe you can, I don't know. I can't, like your average white person, I just can't see that. But with Muslims, absolutely. This is the thing. They see the, quote, extremism, and they do nothing, which basically means they're okay with it. How many times do we have to hear this about the Nazis? Like, just because you were following orders doesn't mean you weren't responsible. But when it's turned around and turned on another group, this protected group of Muslims, the same rules don't apply, unfortunately. And yeah, Tommy's good at exposing all of this. I just wish he would see that there is a racial component, there is an ethnic component, and this is partly why I struggle with the idea of democracy as a whole, because in order to understand all of these nuances, in order to understand that there's a difference between hating people for the color of their skin and making policy decisions based on racial differences that have been studied and backed up by centuries of history, it requires some intelligence. And not just intelligence, but also willingness to go against the grain. The average person, they don't really want that, right? But they can understand what Tommy's talking about. They're very frustrated by what's happening. The actual effect. They've been told over and over again not to focus on the cause, i.e. race and culture, but man, they certainly know something's wrong, and all it takes is someone who's adroit and good at talking like Tommy to point that out to them. So yeah, it's definitely not an IQ thing. Like the differences between race, it's not so much an IQ thing as it is an in-group preference thing. Other groups have strong in-group preferences, and we're seeing that whites have put themselves in a very dangerous position because they lack this strong in-group preference. So something's got to give. Either the other groups have to become less preferential for their group, which is unlikely, let's just be frank about it, or whites have to get stronger in their in-group preference and do things like closing their borders. As Trump says, until we can figure out what the hell is going on. Okay, so we'll move on to cultural Marxism. And I give Tommy a C+ here. I want to talk about, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Anjem Choudhury. He is an imam and an Islamic extremist, to say the least. He's set up various prescriptive groups in the city of Luton, Tommy's hometown. And so this is part of the, quote, radicalization of Tommy, is just, seeing that they can do this and that they can get away with this stuff and that they're not being pursued by the authorities. They basically have a free pass to do whatever they want, especially in these areas which are basically ghettos for Muslims. Chowdhury referred to, this is from Wikipedia, Chowdhury referred to the September 11 terrorists as magnificent martyrs. He also refused to condemn the 2005 London bombings, and he blamed the 2013 murder of Lee Rigby, an off-duty British soldier, on British foreign policy. He said, look, at the end of the day, innocent people, when we say innocent people, we mean Muslims, as far as non-Muslims are concerned, they have not accepted Islam. As far as we are concerned, that is a crime against God. So very, very clear language there, right? He's basically saying, yeah, this is a takeover because you think you're innocent, but you're not because you haven't accepted Islam, and that's a crime in our book. And these are the laws. This is the whole idea behind Sharia law, is to impose this on non-Muslims. Again, that is how Islam spreads. So, that argument of, well, these attacks are just a justification for your government's foreign policy, which has been attacking us. A lot of people are sympathetic to that. Tommy's had to answer this question before, I know, and frankly, he doesn't do a very good job of it. He's like, well, I don't agree with those policies, but that doesn't justify the terror bombings and so on. You really can't argue with that if you accept the liberal premises, right, of egalitarianism, if you accept the premises of multiculturalism. In that view, the British government basically has to look out for all of the people around the world, right? Because there are no differences. And so, it'd be bigoted to discriminate against people who aren't in your country just because of happenstance. That doesn't hold up with universalism. So, yeah, if the British government is going and bombing Afghanistan and Pakistan or Iraq, what have you, how can you argue with retaliation? Because we're all just equal. You can't ever have any kind of loyalty to your people. The nationalists can dismantle this immediately by just saying, well, it's our people. We want to do what's best for our people. And I would agree with Tommy that, yeah, these foreign policy things, they're horrible. Get the people out of government who are trying to nation build over there. It just isn't going to work, and it is driving people into these countries, and it is orchestrated. You can't deny that. You can't deny that all of this is an accident. Oh, we just happened to bomb them, and that just happens to create these refugees, and it just happens that a bunch of men are coming into Europe to rape our women and change our laws. That just all happens. On the other hand, compare Tommy Robinson with this Chowdhury imam, who says that, quote, a British passport is no more than a piece of paper. Well, that's quite true, isn't it? At least that's what Britain has become. It's just a bureaucracy. That's all it is. This flag, it means nothing. The St. George's flag, all of their monuments, their historical figures who are worshipped by many, it means nothing. Because now it's just whoever wants to come into Britain can come into Britain, and you can't say boo about it. Unless they're a white Nazi, like Brittany Pettibone or Lauren Southern. And when Piers Morgan... Here, you have to hear this clip. I'm going to put this clip in. It's of Piers Morgan accusing Tommy of Islamophobia in an interview.
I differentiate Muslims from Islam.
Right.
Okay?
But what you don't do...
differentiate Muslims
Muslims are people. Islam is an idea.
Yeah.
Islam's an idea, a bad idea.
And
Islam is a
Muslims
faith.
follow.
No, it's an idea.
It's a faith.
It's an idea that you can change your mind.
No, it's a faith. Like Christianity.
Like Scientology.
Like all faiths.
Like
it's a religion, it's a faith.
Like Scientology?
So, Tommy,
an idea.
if you accept,
it's an ideology.
if you're saying that the problem is with Islam, are you accepting that you're Islamophobic?
Because there are 100 verses in this...
Yes or no?
Okay.
Are you Islamophobic?
There's no such word as Islamophobia. Phobia is an irrational fear. It's not irrational to fear these things. Now, if I hold this book up and say, there will never be peace on this earth so long as we have this book, it's a violent and cursed book. That's
Can
I tell you who said that? Can I tell you who said that?
You put
Sir William Gladstone said that.
You wouldn't do that with...
Sir William Gladstone
would you do that with the Bible? Show some respect.
Show some respect.
Show some respect.
Have you read this book?
For people...
Have you read this book?
There are over a billion people...
There are 100 verses in this book that incite violence and murder against us.
Show some damn respect for people's religious beliefs, right?
I should show some respect for a book that incites murder against me and
put it down.
And calls me an animal. No, I won't put it down. Sir William Gladstone held this book above his head in Parliament and he said there will never be peace on this earth so long as we have this book. It's a violent and cursed book. Was Sir William Gladstone, who we have statues across our capital C, was he a bigot or an Islamophobe?
See, now
Winston Churchill...
You're sounding like a complete lunatic.
No, I'm quoting some of the best leaders in this country.
You're sounding like a bigoted lunatic.
No, I'm not.
Somebody that basically... You are an Islamophobe who hates Islam.
No, I don't
You basically think all Muslims are to blame.
No.
We've seen you on video saying it. And what you're doing now is deliberately inflammatory. It is deliberately poisonous.
How's this inflammatory?
And you are having the complete opposite effect to the one that you say you have.
William Gladstone.
You are stirring up hatred. You are abusing people's religion. You're abusing their faith. And you're being a complete disgrace.
What do you know about the Prophet Muhammad? We've established nothing. You are ignorant.
I know that you're deliberately insulting people.
What do you know about the Prophet? How am I insulting people?
Who have deeply held religious beliefs.
And
you flouncing the Quran around in your hand in that disgraceful manner is outrageous.
This book is the reason we're in such a mess. No. That's a reality.
No, we're in this mess because people take Islam, they are terrorists, and they abuse the nature of Islam and the wording of Islam, and they perpetrate evil, and it is completely wrong. For you to try and claim that the vast majority of Muslims, who are decent, law-abiding people, to try and abuse and mock their faith and their holy book is an outrage.
Their holy book. When you talk, when the sacred months have passed, slay the non-Muslims wherever you find them and take them captive and besiege them and prepare for them in ambush. Who's slaying who? I'm not inciting hatred. This calls for my death.
Yeah, so Piers is throwing this Islamophobe accusation at Tommy, and I think rightly so. Tommy comes back and says, you know, phobia is an irrational fear, and it's not irrational to be afraid of Muslims. And I would agree. It's not irrational to be afraid of these people. It's also not irrational to be afraid of those people because of their ethnicity. You know, genetics matter. There's a reason that the people who created Islam look like most of the people who have adopted Islam today. I don't think it's just an accident of birth, right? And that's not to say that, like, all Arabs have to be blamed for what Muhammad has done. I would love it if Arab nations could throw off Islam. I think that'd be great. You know, I think the feminists in the West should go over there and try to work their magic there. That would help us out a lot. But of course, they're not going to do that because they're interested in the opposite of helping us out. But this is what it comes down to. So, does Tommy oppose cultural Marxism? Well, I don't think he's doing a very good job of opposing it. You know, on the surface, yeah, he's saying cultures or religions, they're not equal. Okay, so he does get some points for saying that not all religions are equal. But even Sam Harris, which I covered in my last episode, he talks about that. This cringy idea that the reason we have to fight back against Islam is because it might affect gays or women or Jewish people. To be fair, Tommy does push back against the transgender thing. But if you accept this idea of my liberal values and that's what I'm fighting for, it's not enough to motivate people. I'm sorry. We've seen that. What is motivating people, I believe, and we see this through the Trump campaign, it's this implicit endorsement of white identity politics. People are being given permission, finally, to say, yes, I want my group to be taken care of. Take care of white people, please. Now, Tommy will say that Muslims, Islamists, discriminate against white people. He will say the white working class are becoming irrelevant. They're the forgotten people. These are all sort of dog whistles, right? Although he's being somewhat explicit here, but he's not saying, he'll talk about the main victims and what their race is the white people. He won't talk about the race of the perpetrators. And to some degree, hey, can you blame him? Like, he's gonna probably get arrested. What am I saying? He gets arrested anyway, right? So yeah, a lot of good it's doing you. It's really just backfiring in your face, Tommy. So that's what I would say for my criticisms. I would just say genetics matter, and the ability to cling on to my values and my piece of paper, the time for that is quickly approaching. It's about to pass, and I think we're starting to see people's patience is really, really wearing thin. And that rhetoric hasn't really gotten us anywhere. In fact, it's just made things worse. The civic nationalist argument. But Tommy is good at dismantling myths, such as the slave trade. He'll say the truth is, white British ended slavery. They didn't start it. He's also good at highlighting the victims of Muslim violence. And this is important, mind you, because it makes it real for people. I mentioned Lee Rigby before, and he did campaign about that. I know he's done a campaign for this woman, Nikki Hurst. Nikki was assaulted by 3 Muslim men on Halloween of last year in Batley. And these men, they smashed her head against a wall, breaking her skull open. She had to get stitches in her skull. And it was a racially motivated attack. They called her white slag. The inspector of the police in that town is himself a Muslim named Mohammed. And surprise, surprise, he refused to investigate the crime despite a petition signed by tens of thousands of concerned patriots after Tommy covered the issue on his channel.
Now, just for 1 minute, if you're watching this, reverse the roles for a minute. Imagine a Muslim woman wearing a hijab has been violently beaten by 3 young white men and faced injuries like these. Do you know who would be sitting here now with you, with the media? The leader of the police force, your local politician. Everyone would be here speaking to cameras across the country, telling them they will find the men that's done this.
They refused point blank to call it a racial attack. They were saying that I had no right to call it that because we couldn't say that that's what it was.
Tommy interviewed Nikki. And it's interesting to note in the interview, Nikki calls the perpetrators Asian men, which you hear this a lot in Britain, and I was confused when I first heard it. Tommy rightly points out at other times that these aren't Asian men, right? Some of them are coming from Pakistan, some of them are coming from Somalia, North Africa. They're coming from all over, but not Europe. So it'd be more accurate to call them non-Europeans. I mean, it's just because you're not allowed to say Muslim. It's this political correctness thing. And so I was heartened to see at least that Tommy pushed back against people using the word Asian when they really mean Muslim. Because there's this hypersensitivity, right? That people they're always afraid. Oh, if I say something, I might be locked up. Like this guy who was charged with time in jail for teaching his dog to do a Nazi salute and then putting it on the internet. I mean, come on. Well, we'll get to free speech shortly. Anyway, Tommy, like Trump had these angel moms. He knows just as well as the media that statistics aren't enough to convince the average person. You need an emotional story with a victim and a face that you can point to. Someone you can point to and say, this is just one sad tale among many. And he does say that, and it's true. Nikki, in his hashtag campaign, hashtag Justice for Nikki, well, she is just one of many. Like, a lot of people go through this. It's just not everyone gets video of it and puts pictures online because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. So for every one of these things that comes out, there's dozens more that are going unreported. But yeah, Tommy knows that you have to approach this from a human perspective and tell these people's stories, because you sure know that the media isn't. The media knows that you have to tell emotional stories, but most of theirs are lies, most of theirs are spin. So they try to tug at your heartstrings, but they're just pushing propaganda. I mean, you could say what Tommy does when he interviews people, you could call that propaganda, but it's backed up by truth. There's got to be another term for somewhere between, just strictly reporting on the truth, the cold hard facts, and the lying propaganda of the media. There's a middle ground, which is sort of what Trump does, and it's what Tommy does. And so I really support him for doing that. The last thing I'll say is just the schools are indoctrinating the children. They're teaching lies about Muhammad as well, telling the children Islam is a religion of peace and so on. And after every terrorist attack, it just gets worse and worse. It's ramped up because everyone's hypersensitive. Everyone knows the truth, except maybe the kids. The kids, unless they've been told, they'll just believe stuff because, you're supposed to believe adults. Why would adults lie to you? That's a whole nother rabbit hole. Like, as a kid, you don't want to find out that your society is that corrupt. Believe me. So Tommy was talking about his daughter, and his daughter supposedly saw him reading a book about Muhammad. He was doing some research, and she just said casually, "Oh, Muhammad, peace be upon him." And Tommy immediately looked at her like, "Where did you hear that, and why are you saying it?" And I sort of have to question Tommy on this. It's like, dude, why are you putting your children in these schools? At this point, I really think that allowing your kids to go to public school should be considered a form of child abuse, especially in the UK, especially where they don't have free speech. They're just getting constantly indoctrinated. And you have to constantly indoctrinate people in order to keep them believing a lie. And you have to keep censoring people in order for them to keep believing this stuff. And so that's why they slander Tommy, is because he's trying to break through that veil. So moving on to free speech. I'm going to give Tommy Robinson an A. And I want to talk about really just the cultural phenomenon that has surrounded Tommy. And of course, we all know he's received hundreds of death threats, and he's been assaulted by people who disagree with him, and Muslims all the time want him dead. The authorities, of course, have done nothing, and it's really just shameful. I know that people have pointed this out before, but it is so shameful, the role of the police in all this. And to say that they're just following orders, yeah, that is true that they're following orders, but why are they following those orders, and how can they live with themselves? Sure, you got to put food on the table, but you still have to live with yourself. And if you turn in your fellow Brits like Tommy, you're just caving to the evil forces. You're just giving up, basically. So I think that the British police have a lot to be ashamed for, and we should shame and humiliate them as much as possible. They're just upholding the status quo, and it's quite terrible. And I think that in the future we will look back on the British police force at this time and just shake our heads and spit on them, really. So they're trying to shut Tommy up, and he's talked about government-funded groups like Unite Against Fascism. Basically, their sole purpose is to put Tommy out of business, one way or the other, by any means necessary. And it seems like they've been successful, based on the most recent news. But this has been going on for a while. In his interview with Dave Rubin back in 2016, he was talking about the PC nature of Rotherham and why it took so long for this stuff to come out and be exposed. And yeah, the reason that the authorities did nothing was because of the fear of being branded racist. That's very plain to see for everyone. Tommy's critics say that criticizing Islam incites hatred, right? It's this idea of hate speech. We can't allow certain speech if it's going to allow certain kinds of ideas to become popular. And Tommy, of course, denies that he's inciting hatred. He says, how can telling the truth be hateful? Now, I both agree and disagree with this. Telling the truth itself does not create hate. However, it is true that when people hear the truth and they realize how much they've been lied to, and they see their towns changing before their eyes, you know, it's hard to blame these people for feeling hate. You know, that's an entirely natural thing. Not just hatred towards these groups, but hatred for the elite. However, I will say it's not Tommy Robinson who's inciting hate. The Muslim terrorists are really the ones inciting the hate, right? They're the first actors in all of this. And so it's not fair to say that he is inciting hate. He is a reactionary to what is going on. And if people end up hating the haters, well, that's kind of natural. But in general, I don't like this idea of hate speech, of course, because if you accept the idea that hate speech exists and that hate speech is bad, and I think Tommy does to some degree, because he says, you know, these gangs, they're radicalized and they're the ones spreading hate. It's the same type of thing as before. It's like, I'm not the racist, they're the racists. You're just falling into this trap. When you say, I'm not the one inciting hate, they're the ones inciting hate, you're accepting the idea that inciting hate is a thing, that inciting hate is bad, and the government should crack down on this, right? And so that's just giving your enemies an opening. That's just allowing them to squash the opinion they don't like, which is the real definition of hate speech. So I would say that we shouldn't be afraid of this emotion of hate. How can you see these grooming gangs and hear about the no-go zones and the Sharia creep and not feel some kind of deep hatred for the evil being wrought on your society? I think it's unhealthy to have any emotion other than hate in that case. Now, Tommy is good on free speech because he's a free speech absolutist, which is surprisingly rare in today's world. He wants to protect the rights of identitarians like Brittany and Martin Sellner, who, if you remember, were barred from entering the United Kingdom just because they associated with Tommy Robinson. And, well, Brittany was going there supposedly to interview Tommy, and I would encourage everybody to go listen to the interview, the band interview with Tommy Robinson. It's on her channel. He talks about a lot of his history, some of which we'll get into in a moment, but he does not agree with their politics, but he still advocates for their right to give a speech. He says everybody should have that right, and that's why he was even willing to take their speech to Speaker's Corner the square in which, you know, it's famous for people giving speeches, sort of an icon of free speech, if you will. He was going to take their speech, and I believe he did take their speech and read it out to the public. And so that convinced me that Tommy Robinson means what he's talking about. He is genuine about the issue of free speech. Another thing is that he doesn't make free speech really the center of his message. He's not just using free speech like, I would say, Dave Rubin, who talks almost constantly about the issue of free speech, but he's not actually talking about what things should be talked about. You know, what are the things that are under threat of free speech right now? I'm being a little hard on Rubin, but I think it's justified because it's these people, they want to use the idea of free speech to gain popularity, but when it comes down to it, if you question them on certain things, they're not really going to stand up for certain people. They're just going to stay silent when certain people get banned, usually alt-right figures or identitarians. I think that's really the true marker, because those are the people getting banned from the internet the most. Tommy has received a ton of in real life banning and restricting, and also on the internet, but you know, the identitarians, the white identitarians, they are the ones really getting banned. And so if you want to look for where someone is on free speech, I think you just have to ask them, should Richard Spencer be able to give a speech to an auditorium, a college auditorium, without being shut down? And so I'm going to close this section with this clip of Tommy reading a letter by a conservative talking about the fear of being a conservative on campus.
And in fact, let me read this. While I'm on it, let me read this. I know it's going to be a bit longer than I expected. Let me read you, because this really should pull at the hearts of every one of you. Hey, Tommy, not sure if you remember. I was in attendance as you spoke at Cumbria last year. Unfortunately, this has become the new normal here on campus. I used to attend Republican meetings and events. Now I can't even go. For me and so many others, jeopardising our grades, our friends, our reputation, and potentially our safety is not even worth it anymore. There are a surprising number of us on campus, but we avoid confrontation and publicly voicing our political views for one very sad reason. Nothing will change. And the virtue and the hate that people like those that protest you tonight is so powerful that it will not allow for anything a conservative Republican or even a classical liberal says to be entertained. This is a real sad state of affairs for America. It's not just America, it's for Britain as well, but for the universities, for the education system, for the future of free thought, free thinking. We're creating people who just, they don't free think. They're part of a mass left organisation that just screams racist, like robots and androids. Anyway.
And this kind of thing is just happening everywhere. It's not just on the college campuses now. It is in the workplaces. It is in your churches, right? And that's their strategy. They just want to shut people down and make them fear for their lives, make them fear for their income. And we know that not everyone is going to be as ballsy as Tommy. A lot of people will cave. I can't imagine getting the kind of abuse thrown at you that he has and not backing down. I'm sure there have been plenty of times when Tommy wanted to give in when he was in prison and so on. And I think he's mentioned that. He's like, yeah, I wanted to just stop talking about Islam because I was fearful for my life and my family. And I think when you overcome that fear, that's when you can become truly a force to be reckoned with. And so I look up to Tommy in that way. It's like, yeah, good on you, man. You have not given in all this time. That is inspirational to people. When people see someone who's been wronged as many times as he has, standing up for what is right. Again, I have my disputes with his thinking on this, not talking about the racial aspect, but you have to admit, this guy has balls, man. So I think that will just about do it for free speech. Now, condemned by elite. If you thought A was good, Well, I'm giving Tommy an A+ here, and I don't give too many A+, but he really embodies what it means to have gotten the ire of the establishment, the elite. And I think for a while, maybe for a long time, the establishment has been afraid of Tommy and what he is capable of. Again, if you go look at this interview with Brittany Pettibone, he talks about his various run-ins with the law. Just this year, he was convicted of contempt of court, and also they got him on a previous charge where he was supposed to avoid filming outside of courthouses and such like that. And so they gave him 13 months in prison, and he was arrested. And this has led to all the, Free Tommy riots and everything, protests. Well, you could call them riots. Some of them kind of got, there was a bit of violence of the patriots there against the police pushing back. But how did this happen? Because Tommy's no stranger to the prison system. He's also no stranger to being stabbed in the back. And it's important to remember that is basically what happened here. You'll hear this idea. Tommy was arrested because he was disrupting court. Like that's what he was charged with, right? But it just doesn't hold water. I mean, Tommy received permission from the police to film outside the trial. He also didn't use any information that was previously public knowledge. And like I said, the authorities stabbed him in the back. If Tommy had gone to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, I have to imagine he would have learned the lesson that he should have known on that day, which is to never trust the cops on these things. Because this was basically a trap, I believe, laid for Tommy from groups and individuals with a lot of power and influence who just decided that his time had come. So, Tommy, he's not always been a journalist, right? He was, as I said, in the plumbing business, fairly successful business around that. And the reason he's doing what he's doing now, of course, he got into some scuffles. I think his first stint in prison had to do something to do with him getting into a brawl while he was intoxicated. But, he talks about some of his other run-ins with the law. He was facing these charges about his mortgage, and so they froze his assets, and he got 9 months in prison around this time. And then the next time was when he used a fake passport to come to America to give a speech right after 9/11. And this time he was put in solitary confinement for 22 weeks. And the next time was because apparently, again, he filled out a wrong form on his mortgage. And in this case, he didn't go into solitary confinement. He was put in a prison with other Muslims who wanted to kill him. And if it weren't for the intervention of some of the guards, he probably would have died. The state tried to buy Tommy out. This is what he mentioned in his interview. And he says he turned them down, but he told them that he didn't want to talk about Islam again because of all of the trouble in his life that he was facing. And then later he was arrested for burglary, and the police were trying to blackmail him. They said they were going to expose him. And then he was charged with some trumped-up hate crime because he got a death threat on Twitter, and he responded to that with something about, I'd be happy to talk about it. Do you want to meet? So he went to prison again, and he managed to escape death narrowly, he says, by fighting intentionally with the Muslims in order to get thrown in solitary confinement. So then this is around the time that he gave his speech at Oxford, and the authorities came and told him, hey, if you're going to give this speech, you can't mention police, Islam, the Quran, or Muslims. And he actually complied with that. He sort of just talked about some of the victims of Islam without going into detail of the topic. But yeah, he still had 8 days in prison. And so that's when we hear about the sugar water incident, which you might have heard of. Yeah, so the story is he goes and basically he beats up this Somali guy who was planning to pour boiling sugar water on him. And boiling sugar water, it'll just stick to your face and it'll take your face off. And he's charged with a hate crime for that. But, if it weren't for another white guy in prison looking out for Tommy, he'd be dead by now. And many people predict that Tommy will die while he's in prison. 13 months is a long time. He's being put in these prisons with like 70% Muslims. And it's just crazy. It's basically a death sentence. I don't think it's a very smart move for the elite. I mean, they're making a martyr out of this guy. Whatever happens to him in prison, we know why they took him out, or why they're trying to take him out. It's because he's openly declared war on them and on the mainstream media. And in this prophetic moment in his interview with Brittany, he announced his ambitions to build the biggest alternative media network in the UK. So he predicted that sooner or later they are going to take me out. And unfortunately for Tommy, the answer to that question was sooner. And it's a troubling thing. It really is heartbreaking when you think about how long they've been trying to get this guy. They've just thrown everything that they can, and they keep coming back, and he keeps speaking out and gaining more influence, gaining more following, waking more people up. I really hope he doesn't die. But if he does, it's really going to galvanize people around the world and in the United Kingdom, I think. I don't know if it'll be enough, but I do think that years and years down the road, we will look back on Tommy Robinson as a hero for what he has done and the sacrifices he's made. I was on Luke Ford's show, and Luke Ford was kind of pushing back at me for having interviewed Patrick Little. And he said, Patrick Little's an extremist. He wants to execute dual citizen journalists. Do you disavow Patrick Little? And I basically said, well, I've never heard him say that. It's probably not something that I want to happen, but I am realistic that the chances for a peaceful solution seem to be getting less and less every day. But when I looked back on that, it just sort of hit me that, we're talking about executing journalists, left-wing journalists. And this is what they've done with Tommy. For all intents and purposes, he is a journalist who has been, or they're trying to execute him, at least indirectly, right? Yeah, they're not giving him the death penalty per se, but it might as well be a death penalty. They know these things, and the judge who ruled on this said, you know what you're getting into, Tommy. So these people know the danger that he's in, and they don't care. So just think about that when you ask me, do you disavow the execution of journalists? Well, do you disavow throwing Tommy Robinson into prison, a non-segregated 70% Muslim prison where these Muslims are, many of them have life sentences. They have nothing to lose by going. In fact, they will become heroes in their community if they take the scalp of Tommy Robinson. So do you disavow that? That's the question we need to ask people. All right, pro-white, pro-Western, I give Tommy a C-. Tommy can point out the liberal double standards like no other. For instance, after the Las Vegas shooting, he compared the aftermath of the attack to what we hear after an Islamic terrorist attack. He said, after the Manchester bombing, the left was going on about, we can't let this change us. We can't allow this to have an effect on our laws. But when there's a school shooting carried out by a white person, what do they say? They say, we need to change the gun laws. So, very obvious. Well, actually, I thought it was kind of a creative point there. And so, yeah, he's great at these hypocrisies. And if you haven't noticed, white people hate hypocrisy. They hate it. It's just that it takes people like Tommy to point it out to them. And it takes many times of pointing it out because, they think, oh, well, this could just be one person who's hypocritical. I don't like that person. White people aren't as good at picking up these politically incorrect patterns because then they might be seen as racist. But they certainly don't like hypocrisy, and that's probably why they don't like the left, because the left is all about hypocrisy. So the reason this grade is low is because half the time Tommy spends trying to dispel the idea that he's not a racist and that the nationalists in the UK aren't racist or far right. As I said at the beginning, I think he's genuine. I think he actually believes what he says, but of course he's falling into the trap of the left by adopting their premises. And the first premise is, of course, that turning away people from your country because of their ethnicities is racist. Why is that racist? It's our country. They don't want to let us into their country. It's just mutual. So there's that, and then the second questionable premise is that racism is if it exists, is a necessarily bad thing. We don't ever have to define racism. We don't have to debate the merits of making decisions based on race. It's just automatically bad because, that's what we were told in elementary school. Tommy Robinson on Nigel Farage's podcast said that, quote, "Speaking out against Islam does not make you a racist or a Nazi." So this is what happens when you try to ignore race. Our enemies will not let you choose a side. You're either pro-white or you're anti-white. Those are the only options being given to you. And Tommy wants to position himself as anti-extremist. Oh, we just don't like the extremes. And that might have been a good strategy 50 years ago. But the country has changed to such a degree that you, Tommy, are now an extremist. You might wish that wasn't the case. And you might think that your ideas are just common sense. But if you define yourself as a centrist, then when the Overton window shifts, you're going to find yourself outside of it. And you either have to change your views at that point in order to fit the mainstream view, or you have to accept the label of far-right radical. I think, personally, that it's much more powerful and influential to say, yes, I'm currently far-right, and people like me are going to alter history until my views are mainstream, and Theresa May is considered a radical leftist. That is the type of thing that Tommy Robinson ought to be saying. Finally, naming you-know-who. Well, I have to give Tommy an F for this one. Tommy Robinson talks about this group only insofar as they are victims of Islamic attacks orchestrated by Hezbollah. He never mentions that this group are influential in bringing Muslims into Europe. And sure, the laws are ridiculous in the UK. Tommy Robinson, if he came out against you-know-who, would... Oh, boy. I mean, the thing is, they already treat him as if he's against you-know-who, even when he's explicit about saying that he's not. Just the idea of being anti-Islam makes people think you're against this group. And he's right to point out that it makes no sense, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to make sense, Tommy. This is the game that they're playing, and you are falling into it. With regard to the question why they're playing this game and why this particular group isn't hostile to a group that's hostile to them, well, they are. It's just that they have another objective. They are. It's just that in the West, they're willing to put up with that. And so I would ask, why can't we just let the Middle East duke their battles out in the Middle East without intervention? Why do they have to bring their problems and their conflicts here? Why do we have to be the policeman and go over there and, play favorites? I think we all know why. It's because without the foreign aid of the U.S. to certain countries, these countries would be swallowed up by Islam, and they would lose. That's, I believe, why we're over there. You ask the average person about these issues, they just, it's hard to get people to care about it. A number of times, Tommy will express what could almost be said as an admiration for Islam, insofar as that Islam forms a brotherhood. And he says that is a really strong force that I don't know how we're going to deal with. This group of you-know-who also forms a brotherhood and also has in-group preference, which takes precedence over universals, over principles. Just about every other group does this in the world except for white people. Christianity used to be sort of a brotherhood, but this is no longer the case, since most churches now allow women to be priests. European identitarians must form brotherhoods or perish. It's that simple. You can talk about Islam until you're blue in the face, but it's not going to have an effect. And I believe that the UK's demise, which Tommy is helping to ensure by not recognizing the you-know-who problem and also admitting that there's such a thing as hate speech, all of this is just ensuring that it's going to happen again. If you say that we should give the government power to shut down hate speech, as I said before, then the people who control the government, they will gladly use that power to shut you down and every group that advocates for the preservation of white people. Because that is their aim. Let's be honest. Their primary aim is self-preservation, but that is tied up in their contempt and their genocidal prescription for whites. So Tommy, you were right when you said we are at war. But the Islamists are just pawns in that war, ultimately. So I suggest you figure out who your real enemy is, and quick. Otherwise, go ahead and deport every Muslim in the UK. 2 generations later, you'll be right back where you started. And that's the truth. And that's why this is such an important issue. Overall, I give Tommy Robinson a C+. From the nationalist perspective, I see Tommy as genuine. I believe that he believes what he's saying and that he is fighting for what he thinks is right. But ultimately, this naivete, it's going to get him killed, and it's going to, at best, lead us down another cycle of history. If we do not learn the lessons of history, if we do not learn that racial differences must be at the center of our politics if we are to preserve the values that we say that we cherish, the values of tolerance. And forget that. Tolerance, it's such a subjective thing. Tolerance for who? Look, I do not want a theocracy to take hold. I don't want an Islamic Sharia law-based theocracy to take hold in Europe. I also don't want a Christian theocracy to take hold, although, the idea does seem to have its benefits. The woman from RT who interviewed Tommy kept saying over and over again, "Would you apply this same thing to Christians?" And Tommy just had to look at her like puzzled, like, Christians aren't the ones blowing people up. We just have to look at the facts. We have to look at the Quran. We have to look at the people as well. Look at the Muslim people who are doing this. Look at what they say now. And look at the ones who may not be saying these extreme things, but they essentially endorse it. They're complicit in it. So I think that the phenomenon of Tommy Robinson is an instructive one. And it's one that we can take lessons away from. He is the last dying breath of air for civic nationalism. And he may draw his last breath in prison because our enemies are ruthless and they will stop at nothing.